It's a pleasure to be here with you. The speaker needs to remove her headset, please. I'd like to point out that I'm at the head of the department for 6 months now, and after the most recent government in September 2021, for the very first time, I'm the Minister for Higher Education. So to answer your question, we must understand that the Republic of Guinea has 3 departments dealing with the educational system. One for pre-university studies, another department in the area of professional training, vocational training, and a third department in the area of universities. Now, generally speaking, the Republic of Guinea has actually made it possible for there to be easy access to education, both at primary and secondary level. And this means that there's now large numbers of students who want to enter in universities. So since 1990 to today, we have seen many diversifications in the area of education. We've opened up channels, both private and public. So we had 5 universities, and now we have 8 public universities with university access through an exam after the A-levels or baccalaureate. And then we had private universities too. So this is open both to public and private universities. And then the entry examination was eliminated, and therefore we had more higher education systems. Now we have 17 higher education institutions and also 32 private ones. So it is easier to have access to the institutions. So there's been this readjustment, and this has also led that infrastructure has also improved immensely. Certain institutions have been we've been able to have structures in Conakry University, Adalaba, and also in Zerikori. Well, generally speaking, there's been further developments. We've also made it possible for private universities to take universities depending on their performance. So access has kind of moved in a very dynamic manner, but supported by the state. So increasing capacity of public universities and with access free of charge. So it is a priority for young Guinean students to have access to these universities after their exam, after their final school exams. Thank you so much. That clearly shows hope, no doubt.
Maldives, Your Excellency, could you please address the same question? Have you seen changes in access to higher education in your country? What are the challenges that the country is facing?
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here, and this is the first international forum that we are participating after the ministry was formed. Actually, there has been a dramatic change in access to higher education in the recent years in the Maldives. This government came into power in 2018, and on day 1, the Ministry of Higher Education was established, clearly indicating the priorities of the government in terms of human resource development, with a special focus on tertiary education. Prior to that, affairs of higher education was dealt by a Department of Higher Education, which was under the Ministry of Education. But the Ministry of Higher Education has a very clear mandate of providing access, equity to access of and quality of higher education and technical and vocational education in the Maldives. We have 2 universities, 2 state universities, and 13 colleges offering diplomas to degrees. Only the universities can offer PhDs, and we have several institutions that can offer diplomas in various diverse fields. I think the access to higher education in the recent past was increased mostly due to government policies and initiatives. And you referred to one key initiative while you were introducing me to the audience. I think the first degree scheme, which was an election pledge by the president, and which was realized in the first 100 days of this government, has paved way to many to actually complete tertiary first degree studies in the Maldives. If they attend state universities, the tuition fees are completely waived. If they go to a private college and seek first degree studies, the degree fees are heavily subsidized. So this paved way for many to realize their dreams of having a bachelor's degree at home while living with the family. We also have a student loan scheme which finances students to continue their studies or start their studies both in the Maldives and also overseas. This government has reduced the administrative fee from 5% to 3%, and earlier this year we reduced it to 1%. So this also has given way for a lot of people to study under government financial schemes. We have also started expanding our technical vocational education programs, and we have a special project where we want to expand TVET to the outer islands. Maldives consists of close to 2,000 islands, and only 198 are inhabited. It is scattered across a large region. So we want to actually provide technical vocational education and also higher education opportunities in the outer islands. So that's a huge project. If anyone is interested, we are still looking for possible investors and also TVET providers who will manage the TVET institutions we are actually building in the outer islands. And finally, another key initiative of the government is the establishment of the first ever Higher Education and Training Act in the Maldives. This is very important because this has actually provided our qualification authority legislative footing. We give a lot of priority to validate qualifications that are obtained overseas to ensure that there's a quality of this that is accepted at a government level. We have a national qualification framework that we use. The Higher Degree Act also established the Maldives National Skills Development Authority, which is responsible for skills development and setting up competency standards for various professions that are needed for the labor market. The Higher Education Act also provides legal protection for private institutions and also paves way for private universities in the Maldives. We don't have any yet. The Act also provides opportunities for foreign institutions to come and open colleges in the Maldives, and at the moment this has not happened. We have recently gazetted the regulations regarding this 2 days before we came to this conference. So a lot is in the progress. But we have a lot of challenges. As I mentioned earlier, our country consists of several islands, and so the geographical nature of the Maldives itself is a huge challenge. You know, it's impossible to have a college on every single island or in every atoll. An atoll is a group of islands in the same, belong to the same reef. So that in turn implies the importance of financial support, which is also critical. Small populations in various islands itself is a challenge because it does not cater, it doesn't help for colleges or institutions to offer programs in their home islands or in their campuses or established campuses because numbers are very, very small. So these are huge challenges that we have to face with. And I think COVID has shown us that the technology is one way in which we could actually address this particular issue. And also various government schemes on financing students and subsidizing programs is also another issue. So overall, to answer your question, I think access to higher education has significantly increased in the recent years, and we only hope that the initiatives and the policies we are putting in place will be there for a long time to come.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much for providing us with this kind of perspective that shows that sometimes geography is also a major constraint. And I think that island states, as you described, have faced a double challenge in that respect. So thank you very much for sharing those progress with us. Finalmente, no en último lugar.
Now, last but not least, can I give the floor to the Dr. Veronica Figueroa? I know that she hasn't been in her job for a very long time, but perhaps she could give us a little bit of information on higher education in Chile. Thank you. Thank you so much. Allow me to greet you in Mapudungun, in my native language.
Muchas gracias por la invitación a conversar.
Thank you so much for this invitation. It's not an official language, but it's important to visualize this all over the world. Higher education in Chile has many challenges, doubtlessly. The first one is, massification in higher education. This has grown in an accelerated way. We had 25,000 students in the 70s. Now we have 1.3 million students in 2021 in universities. So that's millions of people who did not have access to higher education. Today they can go to universities or to the technical vocational training institutions. The fact that there are so many students is taking place in a society which is hugely suffering from inequality, because the poorest people are still having trouble having access to university. Even though people may have been able to have more access, there's still a huge gap. Those students that are from the most vulnerable socioeconomic spheres have two major difficulties in Chile. On the one hand, it is highly likely that they are faced with a problem of educational level to access and to remain in higher education, and therefore to participate competitively in a single system to access universities, which is based on academic criteria. We're changing this now. We are making progress to allow individuals to access universities, which also looks at the background of students apart from their academic performance. And then, of course, you've got problems in terms of funding, expenses, the levies you have to pay, or possibly also the difficulties in transportation. Families need to get a loan for their students or their children to study. According to the central bank, 2 out of 3 households in Chile have a debt, which is about half of their income, and educational debt is the one that has the highest financial burden. So basically, the average size is 50.6% of the total available income. And then there's a fourth challenge, and that is because of the diversity that exists in Chilean society, both in our ethnic composition, also gender and nationality. In the case of indigenous peoples, the most recent population census 2017, almost 13% of the population, we identify ourselves as being part of the indigenous groups in our country. But in terms of access to university or employment, we have the lowest figures from the socioeconomic and statistical point of view. And then, of course, in the case of women, our inclusion in the educational system has, of course, progressed over the most recent times. And, of course, in the higher educational system, women are in a majority. If you look at the figures in '84, where we were 37% of the students, and now we're 55% of the students in universities. But our access to higher education still follows very traditional patterns. The fact that certain studies are very much related to women, especially in the care sector. Most of the women went to health and nursing sectors in universities, whereas men were in technological curricula. So 35% of the women who graduated from university went into the healthcare sector, whereas a much larger number were the men who were more in the technological spheres. Now, of course, we also have great difficulties in Chile because of residence permits in the case of foreigners, and they have no access to loans, and also very difficult for their studies to be recognized in Chile. Our government is working on this. There's a challenge, and we're working on this so that access to higher education needs to be based on democratic criteria representing our society, not as something that is affirmative in itself in order to recognize these inequalities, but also because this universities trains you for citizenship. It has to be feminist. We are a feminist plurinational government. So the wealth of debates will enrich individuals. We will have leaders who can take decisions and can truly carry out structural change, not just symbolic change. We believe that in universities, if you have languages, voices, bodies that are different, this enriches the society. And to conclude my first comments, it is very important for higher education in Chile. This is definitely one of our priorities. It needs to be focused on sustainable development, on human development, and also human rights need to be seen as a key element to overcome inequalities. We think universities are there for political transformation, for social transformation, and we need to contribute from the public side to a society which is more equal and non-discriminatory. Thank you so much, Madam Secretary. Can I just highlight two aspects? First of all, to identify and focus particularly on certain groups which need specific policies. And then in the light of what you have just said, it would also be very good in a future World Congress on higher education. We need to focus particularly on feminist policies in the area of higher education. We need to deal with that. Thank you so much. Thank you. I will now speak to the Minister. We need to remember when we talk about higher education, we can't just rely on universities. There are also other institutions, especially those for vocational training, technical training. You talked about the possibilities offered through the diversification of supply. So what is the challenge here? Do you have to rely on technical and professional training and taking into account the whole issue of reputation, the prestige of universities? Perhaps you could speak about this.
Yes, thanks very much. What I should point out is that in our new government, we have a transition government under Madame Mudria, and also the view of our Prime Minister, that the view is that the education system is part of the whole process of removing the tyranny of education by focusing on vocational training in our country. Now we have 3 departments. We're ensuring structural reforms so that technical and professional training is combined with tertiary education. So we have technical schools and professional schools for vocational training, and there's a good network, and that is spread quite evenly across the country. So we have a common view for really making the most of our assets. So since April, my department has been collaborating with the other two subsector departments to create the orientation workshop, orientation process, which has enabled us to go throughout the country speaking to young people and to talk about vocational training possibilities, but also higher education, so that we can show high school students that there are other possibilities. There is technical and vocational training, which is not just a plan B. So we're telling the baccalaureate students, high school students, that when they choose technical and vocational training, this is a very good choice. So we've raised the awareness amongst school students in secondary school, and those who are moving towards the baccalaureate, the last 2 years of school. And we've got 900 school establishments where we've really focused on technical and vocational training. And we've reminded these high school students that if after technical training, if they got a diploma or BTS diploma, for example, they can access higher education if they wish to have a higher diploma. Now, we need a change of mindset, also amongst parents, because there's often a family pressure. Now, this is a problem that occurs especially in developing countries such as mine. So we've presented these technical and vocational training to high school students, and we've explained that this is a perfectly good choice. So we have a vocational training minister who joined the government at the same time as me, and so they want to attract more qualified workforce who can work in these companies, who don't necessarily need to study engineering or a master's or a PhD. So we're trying to change this trend. So this issue of employability is better aligned, and that we can use technical and vocational training to train young people. Now, this is our government's dynamic and what we're doing in education at the moment. Okay, thank you very much. If I've understood correctly, I think that we need to underline the importance of communication and awareness raising in your country, and also the idea that it's a choice that can lead to later to higher education if they wish. So in a country like yours, there's also a minister who's entirely devoted to technical and vocational training. So that shows that the importance has been given to this in your government. Thank you very much.
Now, you already referred to TVET, Technical and Vocational Education and Training, in your first contribution. Now, I was wondering if you could expand a little bit, your views about the role that technical and vocational education can play in granting access to higher education in your country.
Thank you very much. I think it's very critical, and it's a necessity for the Maldives. We have a lot of challenges, as Your Excellency pointed out. A change of mindset is a huge challenge, especially because of the public perception over the past on the jobs that makes your hands dirty. But what happened in the Maldives is when COVID hit us, a lot of the skilled and semi-skilled personnel working in the tourism sector, most of them foreigners, they left the country, and there was a huge void in the tourism sector, and we were in a very dire situation where we wanted to train people as quickly as possible to fill those vacancies, so that the tourism sector could be functional as soon as possible, because that is the major income generator for the country. So we actually started special programs. We launched a Skills for a Resilient Workforce program, where we actually started offering students a special stipend simply because they have enrolled in this program. And because it was COVID, COVID gave us a lot of new opportunities, forced us to think in different angles, and which provided us a lot of opportunities. So we started providing TVET programs, the theory online, but the practical components was provided in the industry, in the hotels, and which actually paved way to increase the chances of being employed by your supervisor. So in the Maldives, what we look at it as a necessity now. Higher education should be on par with technical vocational education. The fact that we have a new Higher Education Act, which established the Maldives National Skills Development Authority, helps us significantly in changing the public perception of this particular area. So this is all very important. We are working. We have recently produced the first ever master plan for skills development for the Maldives. So we have achieved quite a bit. So now it's a matter of working through these documents, convincing the public that this is a good option for their kids. This earns sometimes way better than a university degree. And a lot of people now realize that. I think in the COVID changed our perceptions about many things. And I think in the Maldives, I may be right, my colleagues are also here, I think our perception on skills development has changed significantly as a result of COVID. I'm not, I hope COVID, I mean, we are not advocating another pandemic, but of course, we have, in this regard, we have greatly benefited. And so hopefully, but the challenges are there. So we have to work through the challenges to ensure this is as attractive as going to a university and obtaining simply an academic degree.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. I think that I would like to highlight the importance that your government, yourself, are attaching to the skills development plan, which I think is really a kind of a strategic plan, you know, that looks into the future. But also, I would like to underline the importance that you have been given to innovation during the COVID times, and also the creation of incentives to attract people to TVET programs, which I think is also quite interesting. Thank you very much. Subsecretaria, ahora es su turno.
So, Subsecretary, it's your turn now. And I'd like to understand what your view is of technical and vocational training in order to improve access. Yes, well, this is very interesting because in Chile, our government program has these 7 focuses, and one of them is strengthening technical and vocational training. And this is something that we see as subsidiary to university education. So a fundamental challenge is how to place vocational training as an option for students and families, and how it can become a fundamental part of education in the territories. Now, in Chile, as occurs in other parts of the world, the productive sector is not diversified enough. It's focused on raw materials, and so we've got a major challenge to respond, for example, to the climate crisis and how this is affecting people's lives. We're already seeing lack of water scarcity, and technology is not the only answer. We do need to train people to help not just resolve these problems, but also to think what the best approach is. And so we believe that technical and vocational training can have a key role in driving a change in mindset when it comes to natural resources, more harmonious ways of living with nature, and a better approach to diversity in Chile. And we've established some priorities for vocational training, which are related to the digital transformation fostering innovation. We're making advances in robotics, but also fostering social, emotional thinking and critical thinking. In Chile at the moment, we have 113 institutions that provide technical and vocational training, and they are training nearly 600,000 students. Most of them are men, and a lot of the funding that supports higher education and making it free, this is a sort of voucher provided by the state to students who have the right to social economic conditions. Now, about 40% of the women in higher education receive these vouchers in technical and vocational training. But this is a real challenge for a government that wants to be feminist, because feminism is about understanding society and societal structures. And the social, productive, economic structures that are being defined from a patriarchal point of view, they aggravate these inequalities, and they increase these inequalities through the neoliberal policies that have been implemented in Chile, especially under the dictatorship. And in a sense, and then there was the return to democracy in the 90s, but they continue to pursue these neoliberal policies. And so technical and vocational training means training students for them to perform specific tasks in the work, but this is something we don't just do now. We want to do more than just training them for specific jobs. We want to help them to think in a different way about the future, so they can make the right decisions in the workplace. And then we're not just talking about technical decisions. We're talking about promoting change, a new understanding of the productive sector, a new understanding of technology, but also relational skills in the workplace. And finally, I'd like to say that since 2016, we've had 15 technical vocational institutions in Chile that have been created by the state. They haven't, however, developed sufficiently, and so this is a real priority for our government. We want to support not just public education, but also not just in university, but also public education in vocational centers. Now, in Chile, some of these technical vocational state centers arose out of from a social demand from the early 2000s, and the people were demonstrating to demand these state universities in the regions, especially those far away from Santiago. Now, it's very much a centralized state where everything goes to the capital, as occurs in a lot of South American states. So we need a lot of citizen mobilization, and there was this demand for state vocational centers in their regions, and that allows training not just in this classroom, but it trains all of stakeholders, as trade unions, companies, social leaders, political leadership, and the state fosters this fluid communication through its policy. And we hope that we're going to be able to strengthen this technical vocational training to create productive clusters, technological clusters, combine them with the world of the universities, and we hope to be able to do that by fostering the right sort of education. We have a number of different bodies that have their role in accompanying technical state technical centers to define the quality parameters and to ensure that they meet these quality parameters. But the debate today focuses on how we can change the concept of quality when it comes to technical and vocational training. It has a multinational aspect. It has a feminist aspect. It has a territorial aspect. It has a diversity aspect, and it's about how we understand development as well. We have a constitutive council that is creating a new constitution. We've set up a new government, and this is opening up important windows of opportunity to put an end to this neoliberal model and to move towards a model of development that's focused on people, and that involves higher education. Thank you very much, Subsecretary. There are three elements here that I think are particularly interesting. First of all, you referred to the development model, a focus on sustainability, which I think is a way of understanding technical and vocational training, which so we need a different model, of course. Now, the other aspect is about regionality and the importance of this being something that comes from the regions. Now, you talked about social demand, and then thirdly, there's this idea that these centres have to come about through a negotiation between the various different stakeholders on the ground. Thank you very much. Madam Minister, I'd like to come back to you with a rather difficult question, I have to say, because you've talked about a work plan that is very interesting. You've already made a number of promises. But the question I have is, in our current context, after the COVID crisis, and in the context in a country that is in development, public funding for higher education, is it following the needs of countries, or is it declining? What's your point of view on this? Yes, thanks very much. The problem of a lack of resources, or the lack of resources in general in the higher education, is a common problem. Now, our government is making and has made education a priority. And this year, there's the financing bill has been drafted. And we've realized that there was not enough funding for higher education. So we know 12% of the national budget is being devoted to higher education. And we've opened up to a greater diversity of funding sources, which come from the national development budget, but also the partnership with financial and technical entities. So we're working with the World Bank to find external funding lines, and that has allowed us to set up a number of projects for young people's employability or centres of excellence, which has an impact on development. Now, Guinea has two projects which have been funded, one for infectious diseases and one for social aspect in the Mining and Geology Center in Ibuke. And we have multilateral works. There's a plan which has been supported by the state of Guinea for a project for Horizon 2020-2029, which supports government efforts for funding higher education. Now, regarding funding, there's also the contribution of the private sector, which is significant. It's something we should definitely take into account, because there are private companies in Guinea which are also supporting higher education. They've set up and improved the people's conditions in higher education. Now, there's been a number of policies, because the authorities have understood that the education is really at the foundation of all states. And so the funding trends, historically they haven't been enough, but a lot of effort has been made so that we can reach the right standard, both regionally, sub-regionally, and internationally. So the work still needs to be done, but I can assure you that our government has made education a priority. So when it comes to funding programs this year, and we've also got the funding bill, and the three sectors in the government are going to ensure that we can get the right funding to our sector. Thanks very much. Thank you, Madam Minister. If I've understood correctly, your government is making an effort which can already be seen in this law, and there's a shared effort with multilateral entities which is underway, and you've also talked about the support of private sources. Now, I'd like to come back to this issue later in the next question, because this is a great opportunity, but it's also a great challenge. So we'll come back to that later. Thank you very much, Madam Minister.
The floor is yours also to elaborate on how your country sees the challenges of financing an increasing demand on higher education in a context that is not really helpful.
So true. That is a huge challenge, especially if you remember what I said earlier, I'm sure you do, about the new initiatives of this government. We have established a free first-degree scheme, which means a lot of spending on the part of the government. We have reduced our student loan scheme administrative fees to 1%, and we have continued to give the student loans. Again, a lot of burden for the government. I think I'm one of the, I'm the only minister in the cabinet who is actually spending the money others are collecting for the government. But I think the key is, as a government, we have to spend on human resource development for a better tomorrow. COVID shows us that the benefits of this. We dealt with COVID very well, especially in the first phase, because we had trained doctors in the country, we had trained nurses, we had trained laboratory technicians, we had trained healthcare assistants. So this allowed me to put my case to the government, to the president, during the middle of the pandemic, that we should not stop any of the human resource development projects in the Maldives. In fact, during the pandemic era, we did not stop any financial schemes for human resource development in the Maldives. So we continue them because we understand the benefits of investing in the person, investing in the mind, investing in skills development. So we continue all this during the pandemic. But it is a huge challenge. We will need the money, and one of the things that we have done is we have established a trust fund. This government has established a trust fund. What we want to do is treat this as a revolving fund, so that we collect the repayments from the student loans and set up this revolving fund, so that we can use that to give student loans in the future, because it's not possible for the state governments in the future, for every single government, to give loans from their budget every single year. That's not very feasible, especially for a country like ours, which has limited resources. We have a few industries which generates foreign revenue for the country. So we are mindful of that. But we are thankful to our international partners and donor agencies for their continued input to help skills development. The World Bank contributes significantly for our skills development programs. The project I mentioned earlier, the Skills for a Resilient Workforce, is funded by the World Bank. They are also helping us resource the various technical vocational centers we are establishing in the outer islands. They are also helping us train individuals. They are also contributing, our SOEs are contributing significantly to our National Apprenticeship Program, which was also established, by the way, during this government, where we attract young people to actually learn the skills at the workplace while receiving an attractive stipend from the state-owned enterprises. So there are a lot of people who are contributing to this, but the main point is it is a challenge. We'll have to find new ways to cater for the initiatives that we have already established, which are costly initiatives. But I think people now understand the importance of investing in the country, in the individual. And they have seen this in the case of Maldives through COVID, and they have no issues when government either pushed back their development, some of the development projects, or redesigned some of the development projects, but they continued to invest as planned all the human resource development plans in the country. So I think it's a key for the future.
Thank you very much, Minister. I think that there are, I'm not sure how many ministers would agree with you, I'm pretty sure Madame la Ministre would, that when talking about financing higher education, we should think in terms of investment into the future. And I think that, but at the same time, I heard maybe implicitly that even if you can't have support in your president, I think that many ministers of higher education, ministers of education, have trouble in negotiating with ministers of finance, and generating a narrative that is really convincing could be a challenge. So maybe we should have another panel. So maybe
we don't get along very well.
Exactly. Anyway, thank you very much, Minister. Subsecretaria, de nuevo volvemos.
So we come back to this question. How is the government confronting the issue of funding? It's a difficult context, isn't it? With so many social demands, so many different fronts that need to be fought, and especially with the pandemic. Yes, well, we have the same problem in Chile when it comes to the finance and it's very complex. Now, when it comes to higher education funding in Chile, it's important to say that there have been big changes. The pandemic has definitely aggravated inequalities in Chile. In 2018, there was a major social disruption. People were demonstrating on the streets, demanding structural changes, a change in the development model in Chile. And that also relates to how we understand education, as we need to fund higher education in Chile. Now, for our government, one thing that we're working on is a new approach to higher education funding. So instead of having an education market, we can have an education system in higher education. Now, Chile sees this as a paradigm shift when it comes to organizing higher education. Now, there's various different things that are required when it comes to funding now. Firstly, families have a choice of educational institutions, but it's not just about equity and democracy. And also, we need to get higher education systems to compete to get students, but that doesn't require them to be responsible for getting them a job, however. And the offer in terms of private education has to exist alongside public education. Now, it's interesting to look at the situation in Chile, because it's an interesting situation. The state has increased its investment in higher education over the recent decade, and it is the state that spends the most in educational resources compared to GDP. In fact, in Chile, in order to fund higher education, we are spending 1.5% of our GDP. That was in 1995, and it's been more than 2% every year since 2010. And in 2018, our country spent 2.4% of GDP in higher education, which is very high. Now, it's interesting to to see that in 1991, 87% of spending in higher education was targeted institutions, 13% was for grants and credit, and in 2021 we went from 79% to institutions and to grants. However, it's in Chile, while public spending was increasing in higher education, this was spent mostly on consolidating the higher education market. And if you look at the figures, we can see that 1 in 3 Chilean pesos that the state has invested in higher education, whether through student grants or funding of institutions, of these 3 pesos, only 1 is spent on state institutions. And so what we've seen is that there's been a reduction in the state support for higher education institutions, but the public funding has increased to private education. So we're having to rethink the funding schemes, and this is a necessary condition for transforming higher education in order to ensure equity, justice, and with a view to sustainable development. And it's also very important that when we talk about designing a financing system, we have to take into account existing inequalities. And we have to take into account the role of women and how women can be placed, often placed in degree courses which have less professional possibilities. They end up with greater debt. So a funding system has to be aware of this gender inequality, this gender gap. And that's what we're working on now. And there are other inequalities that I talked about before in terms of the indigenous population. We have almost no information about how the funding works in relation to the indigenous population. But we feel that funding has only aggravated this inequality when it comes to ethnicity and regions, and in terms of the degrees that they choose.
There's also another challenge which is important, how to change the mechanisms for funding. What happened in Chile over the last few years are policies to increase access to higher education through a system of education free of charge. It's a voucher that students receive, but at the end of the day, it goes to private institutions. And we feel that it's important to increase the funding for higher education so that it goes to state universities through a funding system which also gives direct funding to universities and vocational training centers. So funding is not just a mathematical calculation. It is a political decision of what we want to do, what we want to focus on, and what type of education we want to give to create a fairer society. That is the biggest challenge that we have in Chile. Thank you so much, Madam. Well, I believe that this is a comment I'd like to make. The Chilean paradox: public funding in higher education has grown, but it has been used for a market structure. So this is an idea that brings us to the last round of questions before opening the floor to any other questions. Madam Minister, Your Excellency, let me talk about the private sector And we know that in a large number of developing countries, private sector involvement has been so important to meet the demand. But at the same time, it is also true that private initiatives can create inequalities. They can contribute to the new inequalities. So perhaps can I ask you a question? What is the opinion that you have, and how do you make sure that the private sector contributes, but at the same time meets the expectations that you have? Well, you need to know that higher education in the private sector are also under the Ministry of Higher Education and Scientific Research and Innovation. This is the ministry that gives authorizations for the opening of universities and is also in charge of all the private institutions in my country. As I said earlier on, as far as the development of private institutes, it was a way to solve the problem of not having enough public universities. So we were opening up training profiles which were carried out by the private sector too. And you said, of course, there have been problems because this has really recreated inequalities. And also the costs of education and the finance, the state-paid scholarships and training for students. And this is what we did until 2018. But then we stopped focusing on the private sector and sending students to the private sector, and higher education, private are taking students only on the basis of their performance and the quality of their training programs. But we need to say, despite all of this, that they do play a complementary role to the public training or educational sector. For vocational training and harmonization of the vocational training courses, we need to get minimum standards based on the cost of living, and to make sure that we don't have this inequality any longer, and that we have support and access for the public sector, but also for the private sector. So we would like to focus on this new vision. It's a public-private partnership, because our concern is how to qualify public and private sector. When you talk about students in Guinea, you have students that have gone either to a private or a public sector, and then they end up in the same employment envelope. So very recently, between February and March, we have gone to the public institutions and look at the realities, but also to the private sector to carry out the same type of investigation to see how this public-private partnership can be formalized, so that the qualification of the educational sector and the qualification of the students can really be promoted on the side, both on the public and the private side. So you have a state vision, madam, most certainly. You are trying to see how within this state vision the private sector can share your objectives. Well, let me just make one thing clear. Today, we are also trying to give financial and technical contributions, especially to the public sector. In 2018, we focused more on the private sector because the state funded public universities, and making sure that we expanded the universities. Universities went from 2,000 to 4,000 students, or from 5,000 to 10,000 students, and the public sector needs to be in a position to absorb the number of students. So it is a question of strengthening capacities. Thank you, Madam. Thank you so much. The speaker continues in English.
Now the floor is yours. We would like to hear from you how your government is considering the contribution of private providers of higher education. You mentioned already how technology could be really an asset in that context, but we also see that there are many inequalities that the private offer could contribute to expand or sometimes generate. So we would like to understand what is your position about that, how you see the contribution of the private providers into higher education.
Thank you very much. I think in the context of the Maldives, private education and TVET providers' contributions is critical. It's impossible, and I have said this publicly in many forums, it's impossible for the Maldivian government to produce the necessary human resource developments in all the areas for all the sectors throughout the Maldives. We need the private sector to be part of this process, and we have given the private providers a lot of opportunities in policy formulation platforms and also in other areas. I earlier referred to our special project Skills for a Resilient Workforce funded by World Bank. One of the things that we have to in the Maldives, one of the challenges we had with the skills development is because there were very few skills development providers in the Maldives. So many people are not really aware of what the skills development areas or what competencies is all about. We need to increase awareness among the people to generate respect for these particular professions, and also to make it attractive enough for young students to actually come into these various skill development areas. And we have now actually targeted private sectors to actually provide technical education programs for our youth. The government is actually, very recently we invited bids from interested private providers to provide technical education programs for the Maldives under this particular project. So we now have 6 new TVET providers in the Maldives who are keen to provide these courses. So this is very, very critical, because without them it will be impossible for us to increase and meet our targets in terms of the numbers. We started this project with an ambitious target of, for the Maldives, with an ambitious target of 2,400 youth for 2 years for the tourism sector. But it will be impossible for the government, which has only one polytechnic institute that's under the Higher Education Ministry, to meet this demand. So therefore we have to increase the number of TVET providers. So the answer to the question is, we think private providers' contribution is very critical. We think it's necessary, and we think they should work with the government as partners in achieving the same targets, because at the end of the day, they will benefit more from the government, I believe, in actually becoming a partner in our work to address these targets.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. My understanding is, as you said, that this contribution is critical at the moment, and that the state of the Maldives considers that contribution the contribution of a partner.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much, Minister. Subsecretaria, ¿cómo ve
Madam Secretary, can I ask you to make a comment on this? Now, we have a mixed vision here. We have private and public sectors living side by side. But of course, the growth has been very unequal, and that has had an effect. Public sector expanded very rapidly, grew a lot in the 50s, 60s, 70s through policies that strengthened university education, but also technical education through the same universities. But because of the dictatorship from the 80s onward, we've had a lot of private sector contributions, and it wasn't always possible to regulate or to control and supervise as the state should have done. And of course, the subsidiary state, which we have in Chile, which is where the market that plays an important role, and where the state has to intervene in those areas that are not attractive to the market. And then that, at the end of the day, means that we get higher education institutions where what we have is a system where you get three large institutions living side by side. State universities, which have had huge problems to get finance, and they've had to compete for the resources of the state, and are still keeping certain quality criteria and the employment possibilities for students. And then a series of private institutions which have tried to keep the quality of their education, and they've been very selective as far as the students are concerned. And then we have other institutions that have been appearing and disappearing because they didn't meet the requirements or because they were not competitive. And that, I think, clearly shows you what the system is like. So in order to get enough quality education, and that means that we need to see how we meet the criteria, not just criteria in the area of insertion into the employment sector, but also we need to look at quality from a much more integrated point of view. And of course, private institutions can do the same and contribute as well. Today we have a distortion, and our government, what it is trying to find is through public policies to try and make sure that these institutions can relate. So involvement from the state doesn't mean that the private sector disappears. We need to find new forms of interdependence. But let us focus particularly on the students and on the educational institutions, especially focusing on the way in which student selection, and we hope that they don't choose simply because of their purchasing power, but also because of the attractiveness of the programs that we have. So it's a system that is very in transition. It faces major challenges, and we'll look at it very carefully from the point of view of UNESCO.
I mean, as you have seen, the dialogue has been really engaging. Now, the time is for you to take the floor. You can either ask questions, share your thoughts, feel free. I'm going to take 3 in the first round. I see 1, 2, 3. Okay, I'll take first the right-hand side, and then I move to the second. Yes. First, yes. Yes.
Thank you very much. I have 2 small questions. Premièrement, pour Madame la Ministre.
My first question is for the Minister. I'd like to know if in your country you have ways of ensuring a quality of these private universities that have been set up to meet the demand of students. And then I also have a question for the Vice Minister. Maybe one of the instruments where you can establish a balance between fair entry and quality. You want to say that there should be more elements than just an entrance examination, but you said it wasn't only be the academic record or performance of the student, but you were also going to be focusing on other characteristics more within the context of the student. Can you explain how that works? I'm Martín Benavides, professor of the Catholic University of Lima, director of the Observatory of the Consortium of University, and former Minister of Education of Peru. Thank you.
Thank you. We are going to pick the 3. On va ramasser 3 et après.
We'll take the three questions first, and then we will get the answers. Good morning. Domingo Medina, the chair of the Miranda Center in Venezuela. Can I congratulate the moderator and the panelists? These are so interesting, and it reflects the spirit of this conference. I would just like to share a couple of reflections on the policies of Venezuela on access and the issues of territories, on inclusion. I'd like to say that in Venezuela we have a national system of entry, and we guarantee the entrance of 100% of the students who have finished and have a degree in secondary education. The state guarantees access to public universities. A second point I'd like to say in the question of territory, of expanding universities across the country, the minister spoke about this, and we are moving in that direction. In Venezuela, you can see two priorities. We have territorial polytechnical universities in Venezuela, and as was already mentioned by our colleague from Chile, we look at the productive activities of the different provinces in Venezuela. And then we make university education municipal through the Sucre initiative. So we therefore can offer educational options for all of the municipalities in our country. And then finally, funding in Venezuela. All university entries are completely free of charge, so investment is done by the state. And that is why I'd like to say the following. Investment of the Venezuelan government over the last few years has been seriously affected by the unilateral measures taken by certain countries against Venezuela. We believe that this conference and other multilateral fora could help us to appeal so that these measures are not taking into account that this affects the people, but also affects investment of the Venezuelan government in the area of university education. The government of Venezuela puts its experience at your disposal, and in the spirit of this conference to share this with all of you. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Anantha Doriappa. I'm the director of the UNESCO Mahatma Gandhi Institute from Delhi. My question relates to that, to the question at the roundtable. What would it take to ensure access to higher education for all? And I see a paradox, and I'm wondering if the panelists can unpack this paradox. Because I connect this to the 1946 Declaration of Universal Human Rights, Article 26, which says education is a human right. Now we have a situation where we're actually putting a price on that education, because when you have privatization, public, when I look at this and with that question and with the Universal Declaration, if I'm a kid and I want to be, and I aspire to be a doctor, I expect, based on what UNESCO now is talking about, the new social contract, which should be guided by the Universal Declaration, that I have that opportunity to explore my potentials. And I don't have to pay a price for that, because it's a fundamental human right. Unless we are saying human rights have a price mechanisms, and it's a structured price mechanisms, where if you're rich, you can have more human rights, and if you're poor, you don't have. And then if you get a loan means I have to pay that back, which means it's still a price. So I have a paradox here. I'm wondering if the panelists can unpack that. Thank you very much.
Point taken. Thank you very much. I'd like very much, if you don't mind, that you take the floor one after the other, and feel free to either provide your thoughts or, or your reactions to what has been said, and then we're going to have a second round of questions. Now looking at my left-hand side. Okay, Madame la Ministre.
Donc, concernant
Well, thank you. On your question as to what mechanisms exist at the moment to control the private educational institutions, yes, actually in 2018 we created a decree on quality in the area of education. In 2018, we had a whole series of recruits. I was one of the very first recruited to this institution. I was in charge of technical training and vocational training, which is a job which I kept until 2019 when I was appointed to the Institution on Higher Education. So there is a national authority on quality assurance, and they're the ones that carry out an assessment and evaluation of the institutions to give a university degree, but then also the training programs and the accreditation of these. So an institution could give you a diploma but no accredited programs, but you could also have accredited programs. But what you need to point out that private universities in Guinea have really been quite happy to join this system of quality assurance. So the state has focused on the private, but today the private institutions are very much prepared to make their programs very performing, and therefore they need their programs to be accredited by the National Authority of Quality Assurance within my ministry. Thank you.
Minister Hassan.
I think the question was targeted on especially on private universities. At the moment, we don't have any in the Maldives. The Higher Education Act, which came into force in 2021, paves way for private institutions to be established in the Maldives. But we are very concerned, and we have a mechanism in place for a long time now to ensure the quality of the education. We have a Maldives National Qualification Framework that is in place, which is based on the Scottish framework, and the Act gives the agency that looks after the framework a legislative footing. So we are mindful of the implications of not taking care of the quality of the academic programs if and when, for example, foreign institutions or their offshore campuses started emerging in the Maldives. So we are very mindful of that because we know the experiences of other countries in the region, especially in South Asia. So we are mindful of that, and we have recently launched, in fact, a few days before we came, we recently gazetted the government regulations on e-learning, because e-learning is there to stay, especially after COVID. So we have to ensure that the quality of the teaching and the assessment is at a standard that is acceptable to the government, and we have to also ensure that the right of the student, because connectivity and accessibility are major issues that we found out during the COVID pandemic. We actually did a research at the Maldives National University to find out the impact of COVID on higher education, and one of the things that the scientific researcher found out is the issues related to connectivity and how difficult it was to transform the teaching materials to a mode that can be used in an online platform. You have to make teachers ready to use these online platforms. So these are things that we've found out to be of varying qualities, and the students are the ones who either gain or suffer as a result of inconsistencies at various colleges. So we are mindful of these things, and we hope that the e-learning regulation that was brought about a few days ago, after wide consultations and huge hiccups and challenges, would be something that would ensure that the right of the learner is addressed.
Thank you very much, Señora Subsecretaria.
Gracias.
Yes, thank you so much on the two questions that were just raised. Well, the first one on access. In Chile, we have a single system for university access. So the institutions, we administer them as a ministry, but the institutions carry out an entrance exam. It's a single exam which you do once a year, and now, as of this year, we will do it twice a year, and then you get, depending on the results of this exam, they will be ordered. The students will be ordered, and that is where the decision is taken as to what universities they go to. But we have another criterion, which is merits. This exam this year is slightly different. It is no longer an exam for entry to higher education on contents, but also competences and abilities and skills. So this basically means that we're recognizing other types of skills of students who want to enter higher education. Well, actually, this led to many challenges. One of them is to identify whether this access system through this exam keeps the inequalities going depending on ethnic background, gender, areas from where you come. So we see that the system is still segregating. So those who can prepare these exams better, well, they come from private schools, and those who get national credits are the men who live in the capitals and come from paid schools, private schools. So apart from other systems for the access to universities, for instance, universities that support highly qualified or highly performing students in order to make sure that these students can also go to university. But now we're generating mechanisms to recognize this merit. That is, it includes people that come from indigenous peoples or come from different territories or islands, people that come from different schools, public schools, and also recognizing merits based on gender. This is one of the things that we need to do to get a much more democratic access to universities. And then on your questions on the paradox, I know that our colleague said something which is a paradox. It's a paradox to talk about of higher education if you talk about this as a social right and a fundamental right and not a consumer good. It's something that the government needs to guarantee. And I know that these areas, if you think of ODSs and other mechanisms, make countries to think about equality and justice.
If we can get a compromise, because I committed to have a second round of questions, if the ones willing to take the floor commit to talk for less than 1 minute, then we can go ahead, okay? Is that right? Okay, so I'm giving, yes, raise your hand. Yeah, I see two. I see two only. Okay, yes, please. Just 1 minute, please. And if you can introduce yourself.
Hola, sí, yo soy.
Yes, I'm a rector of the University of Chile, and now what you've said is very eloquent and very clear, but I'd like to say a couple of things about this model in Chile. In Chile, you can discriminate between students. You can't, because they've all got the same rights, and so those who are in, whether in private or public, and so there's a double-sided sword, because. But what I wanted to say is that what seems, 50 years ago when students were asking university education for all, this has become true because thanks to the right, because the right made a lot of money out of this. So there's a paradox here. Now, I'm a doctor. Now, they say in medicine that when your appendix bursts, it hurts, but it stops hurting. But then when you get a peritonitis, which can kill you, and now that's and I think something similar has happened in Chile. It's like a fool's paradise. We think, great, everything is great, everything has been widened, but what they don't realize is that they're incubating a larger problem. So the students said, look, we mustn't get debt, but you have to be very, very careful to not enter a fool's paradise, especially when it comes to politics. Now, I hope we're going to have important social changes in Chile. Well, let's hope we will, but I don't know what will happen there. But I think what the subsecretary has said, and what she said is very clear and very eloquent. Thank you.
Yes, the gentleman behind you. And that will be, please, if you can really be up to the point.
Yeah, I'll try to be very, very brief. I'm Sebastian Matos from the UNESCO Institute for International Higher Education in Latin America and the Caribbean. My first question, I have two very brief questions, is c'est pour Madame la Secrétaire.
It's for Madam Minister. Now, we see the importance of the private sector and in companies in funding higher education. And I think that's very important. But I feel we need a change of mindset when it comes to the private companies, so that they understand the importance of investing in higher education, of investing in people. So my question is, what have you done in Guinea to help companies to change their mindset? And my second question is very brief for the Madam Secretary. Is in relation to immigrants. This is a very important issue in Latin America. Above all, this issue of having their degrees recognized, especially within the framework of the recognition agreement. Now, what approach do you have in Chile to this recognition agreement, and what mechanisms have been used to include the migrant population, because there's a large migrant population now in Latin America and certainly in Chile? Thank you very much.
In two questions, and then, so I'll give you the floor to the two of you, and then just your last thought, if you wish, Minister. Madame la Ministre.
D'accord.
Yes, thank you very much. So to answer your question, as I said, our department is supported by both the public and political world, because there's a desire to invest in higher education. Now, in November and January, we did what are called the dialogue days on education. We invited socioeconomic stakeholders to talk about their involvement in defining training when it comes to funding, but also for evaluating these training sessions, because they've been trained in these universities. And so we've set out the reforms and said that they have their role to play in creating these training programs, so that the government can tell them what their place is when it comes to training young people. And secondly, there's the desire to bring them into the world of governance in higher education by setting up a governing boards, and the chairs of these governing boards are the heads of companies. So the Director General of the Mining and Geology of Burkina, I was involved, and there were 80% of them, of the board, came from the private sector. And so I was able to ensure the funding of these company directors who were able to fund the education system directly. And so this is something we want to apply to all higher education institutions, and this is something that the head of state wants, who's given clear instructions so that there can be functional governing bodies and that involve the private sector in both dividing but also funding training programs. And my department has initiated discussions with some partners in the socioeconomic sector so that we can have alternating programs, and we can also accompany them in the increasing the employability rate and reducing the unemployment by making young people more employable. Thank you, Madam Minister. Yes, that'll be a very good question. This is an issue that's very much in vogue, how countries, how states deal with migration and mobility and the right of people to move, and how states can recognize their degrees and to ensure a recognition of their degrees from other countries. Now, as a country, we have various different multilateral agreements and bilateral agreements with certain countries. We've also set up meetings to see how we can advance with this. When it comes to the recognition of degrees and diplomas, but we also want to do it in line with other policies. The degree recognition needs to be seen within the context of the country, because there was a country where there was traditionally has been emigration, but now we have got a lot of immigration. So, and we've got we've changed. We have to change the laws, and that's what we're doing. Thank you very much, Subsecretary.
Closing remarks, maybe.
Thank you so much for the wonderful opportunity. I think it's always useful for us to learn from others' experiences and learn, especially to find out the struggles they have gone through to actually to provide quality higher education and techno-vocational education in the other countries, because there's no point in reinventing the wheel. So it's beautiful to hear the different languages as well. So my final comment it would be this. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, we are running really late. The colleagues are just asking me to close, but let me say something. In 4 minutes, there is another panel on the right to higher education. So I encourage you, if you want to continue this conversation, please go to the next panel. Thank you very much to our panelists, and applause to them.